What if one of the most celebrated heroes in human history would be considered deeply troubling if he lived today? That sounds absurd at first. After all, when most people hear the name Hercules, they don't picture a moral dilemma. They picture strength, triumph, courage, the ultimate hero. A figure so iconic that his image has survived for more than 2,000 years, carved into statues, painted onto temple walls, retold in books, films, and classrooms across the world. But here's the question almost nobody asks. What exactly made Hercules a hero? Was it his character? His wisdom? His restraint? Or was it something much simpler and much more uncomfortable? His power. Because when we strip away the glowing aura of myth, something strange begins to emerge. Hercules is remembered as a protector, yet many of the qualities that define his legend are the very same qualities that would make us nervous in any ordinary person. Immense force. Unquestioned dominance. The ability to impose his will on the world around him. And that raises a disturbing possibility. Have we confused strength with virtue? Think about that for a moment. Throughout history, civilizations have celebrated individuals who could accomplish what others could not. They defeated enemies, solved crises, overcame impossible obstacles. But when societies tell those stories, something curious often happens. The results become more important than the methods. The victory becomes more important than the cost. The stronger the hero, the less likely anyone is to question him. And that is where Hercules becomes far more interesting than the simplified version many of us inherited. Not because he was unique, but because he may represent a pattern that keeps appearing throughout human history. A pattern hidden beneath a lion's skin. A pattern carried in the image of a wooden club. A pattern preserved inside every statue erected to honor strength. Those symbols are more than decorations. They are memory fragments from a civilization trying to answer a difficult question: what should society do with people powerful enough to protect it, but also powerful enough to frighten it? Because the line between a guardian and a threat is often thinner than we want to admit. And the deeper we look into heroic myths, the stranger they become. The monsters are obvious. Everyone remembers the monsters. What people rarely examine is why every act associated with overwhelming force seems to increase the hero's glory rather than increase our suspicion. Why does power generate admiration? Why do victories create moral authority? And why do entire cultures seem willing to overlook contradictions once someone has been placed on a pedestal? Those questions are not really about ancient Greece. They are about us. Because Hercules did not survive for thousands of years simply because he was strong. Countless strong men have been forgotten. His legend endured because it touched something buried deep inside the human mind. Something that still influences how we choose leaders, how we define greatness, and how we decide who deserves admiration. Which leads us to an even larger mystery. If Hercules became the symbol of heroic strength, what does that reveal about the civilization that created him? And more importantly, what does it reveal about the civilization listening to this story today? Before we can understand Hercules, we need to separate two ideas that most people instinctively merge together. Power and virtue. Because they are not the same thing. Yet throughout history, humans have repeatedly treated them as if they were inseparable. Why? Why does extraordinary strength so often create an assumption of moral authority? The answer may have less to do with Hercules himself and more to do with the psychological function heroes serve inside a civilization. Every society faces the same problem. Order is fragile. Fear is real. Uncertainty is constant. Communities need symbols that reassure them that chaos can be controlled. They need figures who seem larger than ordinary life. Figures who can stand between the known world and whatever threatens it. That is where the hero enters. Not merely as a person. As a solution. And the moment a hero becomes a solution, something subtle begins to happen. The standards applied to ordinary people begin to change. Actions that would normally raise questions start receiving praise instead. Contradictions become easier to ignore. Complexity becomes inconvenient. The symbol becomes more important than the individual. This is where the lion's skin becomes more than an artifact. It becomes a memory fragment. A civilization looking at raw force and transforming it into legitimacy. Not because force automatically deserves legitimacy, but because people desperately want to believe that the force protecting them is fundamentally good. That desire creates a fascinating contradiction. The stronger the protector becomes, the harder it becomes to evaluate him objectively. Because criticizing the protector can feel like criticizing the protection itself. And once that happens, mythology begins to perform one of its most important functions. It stops asking difficult questions. Instead, it organizes reality into a simpler story. Order versus chaos. Hero versus monster. Civilization versus threat. At first glance, that sounds reasonable. But look closer. Who decides who counts as a monster? Who decides where the line is drawn? And perhaps most importantly, who benefits from that distinction? Those questions rarely disappear. They simply move into the background. The spotlight remains fixed on the hero. The shadows become invisible. This pattern extends far beyond ancient mythology. History is filled with individuals who became symbols long before they became understood. The symbol grows larger. The person becomes harder to see. Over time, admiration begins replacing examination. Memory replaces scrutiny. Legacy replaces accountability. And that transformation may be one of the most powerful forces in human culture. Because once a figure becomes sacred, criticism no longer feels like analysis. It feels like heresy. That is why the statue matters. Not the stone itself. The meaning behind it. A statue freezes a person in a single interpretation. It tells future generations what to remember. And just as importantly, what to forget. The empty throne serves as another memory fragment. A reminder that every civilization must answer the same question: who deserves authority? But there is a hidden danger buried inside that question. People often assume authority emerges from wisdom. Yet history repeatedly shows that authority can emerge from visibility, success, reputation, fear, or strength. And when those qualities become confused with virtue, entire cultures can begin mistaking effectiveness for goodness. Suddenly the discussion is no longer about Hercules. It becomes a question about human perception itself. Why are people so willing to associate victory with morality? Why do accomplishments generate trust? Why does power create admiration even when evidence remains incomplete? The deeper we investigate the hero, the more the focus shifts away from his actions and toward the audience watching him. Because perhaps the most important mystery is not what Hercules did. Perhaps the real mystery is why generations of people looked at the same figure and saw something they desperately needed to believe. And if heroes are partly created by the societies that worship them, then an even more unsettling question begins to emerge. What happens when a civilization becomes so attached to its heroes that it can no longer distinguish between protection and domination? If the line between protection and domination is so difficult to see, then we have reached the most uncomfortable part of the story. Because the real contradiction is not inside Hercules. It is inside the idea of heroism itself. Most people assume a hero exists to solve a problem. But what happens when the qualities required to solve that problem are the very qualities that can create new problems later? That is the paradox civilizations have struggled with for thousands of years. The protector must be powerful enough to confront danger. Yet the greater that power becomes, the more difficult it becomes to contain. The same force that preserves order can also reshape it. The same figure who inspires trust can eventually become impossible to question. And that is where the image of Hercules begins to shift. Not from hero to villain. That is too simple. The deeper contradiction is that he embodies two opposing ideas at the same time. He is both the answer and the warning. Both the solution and the risk. Both civilizations. Shield and civilization's test. Notice how different that perspective is from the stories most people inherit. We are often taught to think in categories: good or bad, hero or monster, savior or threat. But mythology rarely survives for centuries because it offers simple answers. It survives because it preserves unresolved tensions. And Hercules may be one of the greatest examples of that tension ever created. Consider the empty throne once again. A civilization looks at strength and asks, who should rule? At first, the answer seems obvious: the strongest person. But then another question emerges. Strongest according to whom? Strongest in what sense? Physical power? Political influence? The ability to inspire? The ability to control? Suddenly the throne is no longer a symbol of leadership. It becomes a symbol of judgment. Because every society must decide which forms of power deserve legitimacy. And history reveals a troubling pattern. People often admire power before they understand its consequences. That pattern appears again and again across cultures, empires, institutions, and leaders. The names change. The mechanism remains. A powerful figure emerges. Achievements attract admiration. Admiration creates status. Status discourages criticism. And over time, the public image becomes stronger than reality itself. This is where another contradiction appears. The more legendary a figure becomes, the less accessible the truth becomes. Legend simplifies. Reality complicates. Legend removes uncertainty. Reality introduces it. Legend creates statues. Reality leaves questions. That is why the statue itself becomes one of the most important memory fragments in this entire discussion. A statue freezes admiration in stone. It creates permanence. But permanence carries a hidden cost. The moment a symbol becomes permanent, curiosity begins to disappear. People stop asking how the symbol was created. They stop asking what was omitted. They stop asking who benefited from the story. And perhaps most importantly, they stop asking what lessons future generations are actually learning. This is where the scale of our question suddenly expands. We are no longer discussing one mythological figure. We are examining a psychological process that shapes entire civilizations. Every culture creates heroes. Every culture creates symbols. Every culture chooses which qualities deserve celebration. And those choices quietly influence millions of people for generations. The consequence is enormous. Because if strength repeatedly becomes associated with virtue, then future generations may inherit a distorted understanding of what greatness actually means. They may learn to admire effectiveness more than wisdom, dominance more than restraint, victory more than character. And that possibility leads to an even deeper mystery. What if Hercules was never intended to teach us what a hero is? What if his enduring significance comes from something far more unsettling? What if he exists to reveal the dangerous qualities a civilization is willing to forgive when it becomes captivated by power? And if that is true, then the next question becomes impossible to avoid. Who was really being tested by the myth? The hero inside the story? Or the society telling it? What if the most important thing about Hercules has nothing to do with whether he was admirable or flawed? What if we have been looking in the wrong place the entire time? The deeper revelation begins when we stop treating Hercules as a person and start seeing him as a cultural instrument. Because myths are rarely designed to preserve facts. They are designed to preserve values. They tell a civilization what to honor, what to fear, what to imitate, and what to become. In that sense, Hercules occupies a role far larger than any individual character could. He becomes a measuring device. A civilization projects its ideals onto him, and in return, he reflects those ideals back to future generations. This changes the entire discussion. The central question is no longer whether Hercules deserves admiration. The more revealing question is why certain qualities were chosen for admiration in the first place. And here we encounter a profound insight hidden beneath the surface of the myth. Strength is not the destination. Strength is the language. The lion's skin is not merely a trophy. It is a symbol that communicates a specific message across centuries. It tells people that chaos can be overcome. The club is not merely a weapon. It becomes a symbol of agency. A reminder that human beings long to believe someone can act when others cannot. Yet every symbol contains a shadow. Every ideal contains a cost. The more a civilization elevates strength as a solution, the more likely it becomes to overlook qualities that are harder to see. Patience, restraint, reflection, wisdom. These virtues rarely produce statues. They rarely dominate legends. They rarely capture the imagination as powerfully as visible force. This creates a subtle distortion in collective memory. Future generations inherit the symbol, but they may misunderstand the lesson. They see the image and assume the image is the meaning. They see the statue and assume greatness must look like dominance. They see the empty throne and conclude authority belongs to whoever can seize attention most effectively. That misunderstanding has consequences far beyond mythology. It shapes leadership. It shapes politics. It shapes culture. It even shapes personal identity. Entire societies can begin rewarding visibility over wisdom, certainty over humility, confidence over understanding. And because these patterns emerge gradually, they often become invisible. People do not notice the assumptions guiding them. They simply inherit them. This is where the deepest contradiction begins to reveal itself. Hercules may not represent the triumph of strength. He may represent humanity's enduring uncertainty about strength itself. The myth does not resolve the tension. It preserves it. On one side stands the desire for security, order, and protection. On the other stands the fear that the very qualities capable of creating stability may also reshape the moral standards used to judge power. Suddenly the myth becomes less about a legendary figure and more about a recurring dilemma inside civilization. How do societies recognize necessary strength without becoming captivated by strength for its own sake? How do they honor capability without turning capability into virtue? And perhaps the most unsettling revelation of all is this: if Hercules became one of history's most enduring symbols, then maybe the myth is not teaching us what greatness looks like. Maybe it is exposing what human beings consistently mistake for greatness. And if that possibility is true, then the next stage of the mystery becomes impossible to ignore. What if the real subject of the story was never Hercules at all, but the hidden psychological mechanism that transforms power into moral legitimacy? If the myth is exposing a hidden mechanism rather than celebrating a single individual, then we arrive at the central revelation of the entire story. The deepest significance of Hercules is not that he demonstrates the power of strength. It is that he reveals how civilizations convert strength into morality. That is the mechanism hiding beneath the surface. Not force itself. Not heroism itself. The transformation of one into the other. This is the point most people miss because they focus on the figure and overlook the process. Hercules functions less like a person and more like a bridge. On one side stands raw capability. On the other side stands moral legitimacy. The myth connects the two. And once that connection is established, something remarkable happens. People no longer ask whether power is good. They begin assuming that power which serves a valued purpose must already be good. That subtle shift changes everything. The lion's skin becomes more than a symbol of survival. It becomes a symbol of justified authority. The club becomes more than a tool. It becomes a symbol of sanctioned action. The statue becomes more than remembrance. It becomes moral endorsement carved into stone. These memory fragments point toward the same hidden pattern. A society repeatedly takes effectiveness and wraps it in ethical meaning. Yet this is where the deepest contradiction emerges. Capability and virtue are not identical. A person can be capable without being wise. Influential without being just. Admired without being worthy of admiration. The myth quietly forces us to confront that distinction. Not by providing an answer, but by preserving the tension. This is why Hercules remains relevant thousands of years later. His enduring influence does not come from physical feats. It comes from the psychological question embedded inside his legacy. What qualities deserve elevation? What traits should define greatness? And who gets to decide? Once those questions appear, the scale expands dramatically. We are no longer discussing mythology. We are examining the architecture of human judgment itself. Every civilization creates heroes because every civilization needs models. Models simplify complexity. Models provide direction. Models reduce uncertainty. But models also create blind spots. The moment a society elevates a figure into an ideal, it risks inheriting the assumptions embedded inside that ideal. If strength becomes the defining quality of greatness, future generations may unconsciously prioritize strength. If dominance becomes associated with success, dominance may begin masquerading as wisdom. If power repeatedly receives admiration, people may stop noticing the difference between influence and virtue. This is the true consequence hidden inside the myth. It is not about ancient values. It is about cultural inheritance. Every generation receives symbols from the generations before it. The question is whether it understands what those symbols are actually teaching. The empty throne returns once again as a powerful memory fragment. Not as a question of who sits upon it, but as a question of what qualifications society recognizes as legitimate. Strength? Intelligence? Character? Service? Wisdom? The answer determines far more than leadership. It determines what an entire culture rewards. And perhaps that is the ultimate revelation. Hercules is not merely a symbol of heroic power. He is a mirror reflecting the values of the people who admire him. The myth tells us less about the hero than it tells us about the audience. Less about strength itself than about humanity's relationship with strength. And if myths preserve the deepest assumptions of a civilization, then a profound consequence follows. Before we can understand the legacy of Hercules, we must first confront a more unsettling possibility. What if the greatest impact of a hero is not what he accomplishes during his lifetime, but the values that continue spreading long after the story has become immortal? The most powerful consequences are often the ones that survive long after the original story ends. That is exactly what makes the legacy of Hercules so fascinating. The lasting impact of the myth is not found in a single symbol, a single lesson, or a single generation. It exists in the values that continued traveling through time long after the ancient world disappeared. Because once a civilization transforms an individual into an ideal, that ideal begins influencing people who have never questioned its foundations. The consequences become cultural rather than personal. Psychological rather than historical. Generations inherit the lion's skin without ever asking why it became meaningful. They inherit the statue without asking what assumptions were carved into the stone. They inherit the empty throne without realizing they are still answering the same question it represents. What qualities deserve admiration? This is where legacy becomes more important than origin. The original context fades. The symbol remains. Over centuries, the symbol becomes detached from its source and begins shaping expectations. Expectations about leadership. Expectations about success. Expectations about what greatness should look like. And that process creates an unexpected consequence. The values embedded inside a myth can become invisible precisely because they become familiar. People stop seeing them as values. They begin seeing them as reality. The influence becomes so deeply woven into culture that it feels natural. Yet the moment something feels natural, it often becomes difficult to examine critically. This is one of the great paradoxes of human civilization. The stories that shape us most profoundly are often the stories we analyze the least. We inherit them. We repeat them. We celebrate them. But we rarely stop to ask what they have been teaching us all along. The legacy of Hercules forces that question into the open. Not because the myth provides a dangerous lesson, but because it reveals how easily admiration can become automatic. How easily symbols can become assumptions. How easily power can become associated with qualities it does not necessarily possess. This expands the discussion far beyond mythology. The same dynamic appears in institutions, nations, organizations, and public figures. Every society creates narratives that elevate certain traits and minimize others. Some celebrate achievement. Some celebrate sacrifice. Some celebrate innovation. Some celebrate authority. But every choice carries consequences. Whatever a culture rewards eventually becomes something people pursue. Whatever a culture glorifies eventually becomes something people imitate. That is why the empty throne remains such a powerful memory fragment. It is not merely a symbol of leadership. It is a symbol of selection. A reminder that societies are constantly choosing what they value, whether consciously or unconsciously. And those choices echo across decades and centuries. The deepest legacy of Hercules may therefore have little to do with mythology itself. His lasting influence may come from his role as a cultural mirror. A reflection of what people admire, what they fear, and what they hope will protect them. The myth survives because the questions survive. Questions about strength. Questions about authority. Questions about legitimacy. Questions about human nature. Yet one mystery remains unresolved. If every civilization creates heroes in its own image, then perhaps the most revealing thing about any hero is not the hero at all. Perhaps the real revelation lies in the audience. In the people doing the admiring. In the values they choose to preserve. And that leaves us with a final paradox that has not disappeared after thousands of years. When we look at our heroes, are we discovering greatness, or are we revealing ourselves? In the end, perhaps the enduring power of this myth comes from a simple fact that is easy to overlook. The story survives not because it gives us certainty, but because it refuses to. Across centuries, cultures changed, empires rose and fell, religions transformed, technologies reshaped the world, and yet the questions hidden inside this ancient figure remain strangely alive. Not because they belong to the past. Because they belong to us. The lion's skin still lingers. As more than an image. It remains a reminder of humanity's desire to overcome fear. The statue still stands as more than a monument. It remains a reminder of our desire to define greatness. The empty throne still waits as more than a symbol. It remains a reminder that every generation must decide what qualities deserve authority, admiration, and trust. These fragments endure because they point beyond mythology and toward something deeper within human nature. We often imagine that progress frees us from the dilemmas of the past. Yet the fundamental questions rarely disappear. Human beings still search for protectors. Still admire confidence. Still elevate symbols. Still struggle to distinguish appearance from character, influence from wisdom, capability from virtue. The forms change. The underlying tension remains. That may be the most meaningful legacy of all. Not a lesson about a legendary figure, but a lesson about perception itself. We do not merely inherit stories. Stories help shape the lenses through which we interpret the world. They influence what we notice, what we celebrate, and what we ignore. They quietly guide our understanding of success, leadership, morality, and human worth. And sometimes their greatest influence comes not from what they teach explicitly, but from the assumptions they leave unquestioned. That is why this myth continues to matter. It invites us to examine not only the figures we admire, but the reasons we admire them. It asks us to look beyond reputation, beyond symbolism, beyond inherited narratives, and confront a more difficult responsibility. The responsibility of judgment. Because every society creates heroes. Every generation creates icons. Every culture elevates certain traits above others. Yet no civilization can avoid the consequences of those choices. Whatever is rewarded becomes attractive. Whatever is celebrated becomes influential. Whatever becomes influential begins shaping the future. Seen from that perspective, the story was never simply about a powerful figure navigating a dangerous world. It was about the values hidden inside collective memory. The values passed from one generation to the next. The values preserved in statues, symbols, stories, and myths long after their creators are gone. And perhaps that is why the deepest mystery was never meant to be solved. Some questions remain valuable precisely because they remain open. They force us to continue examining ourselves. They prevent certainty from becoming complacency. They remind us that wisdom often begins where simple answers end. So when we look at the lion skin, the statue, and the empty throne, we are not really looking into the distant past. We are looking into a mirror. And perhaps the most important question is not whether a civilization chooses the right heroes. Perhaps the more important question is whether it understands what its heroes reveal about the values it holds most deeply. Because in the end, the stories that endure the longest may not tell us who we were. They may tell us who we still are.